Welcome to Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive with Dr. Rebecca Risk. Do you ever feel that even though nothing seems seriously wrong and you pass all the medical tests, that you still feel that your health, pain, and fatigue are completely out of control? It doesn't have to be that way. Listen to the tips and suggestions given on our program today and take back control of your health. Now, here is Dr. Rebecca Risk.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Falling Through the Cracks. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Arianna Sholes-Douglas, who is the founder of Tula Wellness Center, a unique medical practice in Tucson, Arizona, focusing on women's health and beauty. Today we're discussing her book, The Menopause Myth, What Your Mother, Doctor, and Friends Haven't Told You About Life After 35. So, Dr. Arianna, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So what inspired you to, I guess, go into women's health? I think that's the bigger question.
Yeah, well, I started my interest in women's health very early on. As a teenager, I had very severe menstrual cramps to the point where I was incapacitated for at least 24 to 48 hours. And I was very active in school, sports, and cheerleading, and I was miserable. And so I remember my mom taking me to different providers. I believe she took me to a pediatrician. I think she even took me to a mental health person at some point. They really didn't quite believe that I was in as much pain and in suffering as much as I was. And then she finally took me to a gynecologist who basically prescribed the equivalent of Motrin to me, and it changed my life. So I pretty much knew at that moment that, gosh, if you could change someone's life from being, almost suicidal in pain and just desperate to being able to fully function, that's what I want to do when I grow up. So that's how I got here.
Well, I find that interesting that you had to go to so many practitioners, including looking into mental health, just because you had such a horrible time every month. Do you find, as a practitioner yourself now, that a lot of women do experience, their doctor not trusting their account of what's happening in their body?
Yeah, and that's probably when I really thought about, what this book meant to me coming full circle. It was kind of a recap of the same thing that happened to me. Instead of going through into adolescence, I was now going into menopause. And even as a physician, I personally was unprepared and did not have the knowledge that I would expect somebody who's, takes care of women would have. And so that also struck me that as a gynecologist, I still don't quite understand this. I missed my own diagnosis for at least a couple of years. And so I thought, gosh, if I'm experiencing this and it really impacted my life, I can only imagine how it's impacting, the average person's life that, isn't a doctor specializing in women's health. So, and then I started hearing the stories of patients who go to practitioner after practitioner and their voices just weren't heard. And practitioners overall are not as prepared as we should be to address the needs of the aging woman.
Well, and this is important too, because I think when people think of the aging woman, we think of, and my mother's going to be upset with me saying this, but I'm just talking about the stereotype. I was brought up a little bit differently, but I know that society, we think of the old crone and she's drying up and, you even talk about this in your book, we're shriveling up and there's not much left of us. Is this a common misconception that a lot of women have when they go through or even talk or think about menopause?
Yeah, and I think it's a misconception that women have, and it's a misconception that providers have, is that, in actuality, we spend so much of our time, which is good, paying attention to women of reproductive age. But once we are done bearing children, then, I guess the interest, the dedication, it doesn't seem to be as fervent. So I definitely, there is this stereotype that, you're just kind of shriveling up and turning into this older person that's not necessarily useful. But in actuality, we start our menopause years as early as our late 30s and definitely in our 40s. We're perimenopausal. So when I talk about, outside of the reproductive years, the average woman isn't, after 40 isn't going to be childbearing. Certainly there's a percentage, but for the most part, after 45, there are a lot of practitioners that just don't even bother to talk about certain issues because they just don't. I don't know if they don't have the skills, they don't have the information, or it's just kind of ingrained in us that it's not on the top of the priority list. And case in point is when we bring, for example, women who have had hysterectomies. Oftentimes they say, well, you don't need a PAP. There are doctors that don't even bother to look in between a woman's legs if her uterus isn't there. But it's like there's a lot more there outside of her uterus. And just because she's had a hysterectomy and not able to have children doesn't mean that we don't deserve to tend to our lady parts and everything else in between.
Well, a conversation that I've had a few times on this show is actually the value on women's health. And I think that you said that in what you were saying is, if we're in our childbearing time and we're trying to have a child and there's an issue there, we can get more attention on our problems, on our menstrual difficulties, on just how we feel hormonally. But other times, just like what you went through, it was difficult to find help because, you're just a child and maybe your account isn't true. The pain isn't as real as you're seeing. Or when we're older, we don't have that goal. We're not trying to procreate. So I think society has put less value on what, a woman's body should be going through. And really, is it important to spend the time and money looking into these problems?
Yeah, and I think there's a new wave of interest, and people are asking more questions, and I'm noticing just more, interest even in the media, and there are organizations and subspecialties of OBGYN that are starting to look at it a little bit more, but we're still a little far behind where we need to be.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Now, if we're talking about menopause, what does that mean?
So the definition really is just the cessation of your menstrual cycle for a 12-month period. So as you go into your 40s, your menstrual cycles are going to begin to become a little more erratic. For some women, that doesn't actually happen until their 50s, but for the average patient who's going to be menopausal at 52, that means that at least 8 years, anywhere from 5 to 10 years, honestly, prior to menopause, she's going to start having some hormonal fluctuations. So by definition, she's menopausal, if she hasn't had a cycle for a year, but really there's no need to separate out perimenopause from menopause because the symptoms are essentially the same symptoms. You can have irritability, the night sweats, the pain with intercourse. All of these things can predate you being, actually menopausal. So that's where the confusion comes in. And that's why they also believe that it probably starts much later, but it really starts a lot earlier than you would think.
Which is, I think, important to note because a lot of women, I think they're free from menopause until they're in their 50s. Yep. And I think, you're talking about 30s. And this is a very common misconception that, this doesn't affect me. I'm only 40. I'm okay. I don't have to think about this right now.
Yep. So what a lot of women think. In fact, I think that's one of the first sentences in the first chapter is that I was sharing this, that I wrote the book to a friend, and she was like in her early 40s. She's like, "Oh, I'm not there yet." And I was like, "Oh, honey, yes, you are. You have no idea." And I was like, "This book is for you. You don't even realize it's for you." But people don't know what they don't know.
Well, and that's true. And I think this is why, you wrote this book, I'm going to guess, is because we don't know. And this is called the Menopause Myth. So from what I gather in your book, there's a lot of myths about menopause. And you talk about how women aren't sharing information with each other and mothers aren't talking to daughters. Now, my mother was very open about her experience, but she did that because her mother wasn't. And she wanted me to understand what I would go through and what would happen for me. And from the account in your book, this is not something that is very commonly talked about in families or even in society or among friends. No,
you are actually an exception, at least from the women that I've interviewed. and I've interviewed hundreds of women around this topic. And even when I speak, I ask people, how many of you had a mother, a sister, an aunt, grandmother sit down and talk to you about anything about menopause? And a room of 100 women, maybe one person might raise their hand. That's the norm. So that's, again, why we need to start having the conversations with our daughters and with our friends, so that it's not something that's kind of, kept in the dark. There's just a lot of ignorance around. And not only that, so that we can be informed. So we, unfortunately, because we have to inform our providers to care for us better and to understand what it is. And we are not doing that as well as we can. So at this point, I think it really is up to the patient, unfortunately, to get as much information, be as armed as possible, because not only are doctors not aware, there's even a lot of just misinformation, and just some of the stories I've heard of people just dismissive, telling them it's not possible for them to be perimenopausal and they're in their early 40s. Really a dismissal is probably one of the biggest ones, and the average OBGYN doesn't have time. At least here in America, USA, they don't have as much time to sit and talk and really have this dedicated conversation to this next phase of life. But it's a huge deal, and it's a huge change.
Well, and I think it's something a lot of women are scared of. And then because of that fear, I feel like they're also, don't want to reach out because there's some denial. It also means we're reaching another phase, and we've been in this phase since puberty. So, we don't want to think about reaching the next part of our lives, because that means we're older. That means we are the crone. That means we're drying up. That means, things are going to suck from now on, sex life, our bodies, that kind of thing. We're going to gain weight. I think this is a lot of fears that women have when they're talking about this phase. I don't know if that's something that you've experienced as well.
Yeah, I think between the fear and the ignorance, we can't really get educated, and again, it's all about perspective, right? It's all about, are you going to look at this as, oh my God, which a lot of women do, like, oh my God, yes, it's like the menopause is coming, and it's a black hole that you might come out okay on the other end, you might not. But in actuality, I mean, if we can change our perspective, really enter that space from a space of gratitude and creativity and anticipation, then we just change our own narrative. So, I mean, it's whatever narrative you want. If you think it's that time where you're going to dry up and life's going to suck, then you're going to dry up and life's going to suck. But if you're interested in really knowing the power of this phase of your life, and how as your hormones change, your brain chemistry changes, and that even empowers you in certain ways. So if you're interested in embracing how you can be empowered and how you can really go forward in your best way, then, and it can be a lovely journey. That doesn't mean it's not without some bumps and bruises, but it's all about the journey. And so if we think that it sucks, then life will suck, and there's just not a lot of joy in that, and I just choose not to approach it that way.
I like the word empowered. I think that was a really good word for this, because if knowledge is power. So if we have the knowledge about what's happening on our bodies, and we start to experience the depression, anxiety, or insomnia, or night sweats, we understand what those are, and we can be more on top of what's happening and what we're experiencing, so we can talk to our doctors about, if we know, this insomnia might be part of the hormone changes I'm experiencing, because I think this is something women aren't always aware of. We can go talk to our doctors and say, okay, so I think that there's some changes happening and I need help, instead of suffering in silence, not understanding what's happening in our bodies.
Yeah, it's definitely, again, knowledge is power. And, again, the only thing I would caution, and it's frustrating, but the reality is don't assume, and that's a myth, that's one of the myths, is assuming that your gynecologist is well prepared to talk to you about this. And that probably is one of the bigger myths, and it's a reality that you, again, need to get this information, know for yourself what this might look like. And again, remember that, how do you want to go through this? Because you can imagine the tumultuous teenage years when our hormones were just doing crazy stuff. Well, this really mimics our preteen, teenage years in terms of the hormonal fluctuation. So it's like, trying to get through life, now you have job and kids and whatever, family or other responsibilities, but you have these hormones that are kind of literally driving you a little crazy or a lot crazy and making it difficult to sleep and just irritability, depression, anxiety. Just trying to manage that and be ignorant that's a really difficult task. So, again, it's so important to be aware of what could be happening so that you're not in the dark, because now you're in the dark with anxiety and depression and trying to manage life, and that's not. There's nothing fun about that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. We're going to take a quick break. We're talking today with Dr. Arianna Sholes-Douglas, and she's the author of The Menopause Myth, and we'll be back shortly.
Healthcare has been a major part of news stories today, with one thing that has been consistent: inconsistency. Both healthcare providers and patients have to work around and get used to a constantly changing set of rules and issues. Nurses have historically been left out of this decision-making. Listen to Once a Nurse, Always a Nurse, exploring the world of nursing with host Leanne Meyer. Health professionals, we invite you to share your ideas and experiences while listening to experts in various areas of nursing. Listen Mondays at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific on Voice America Health and Wellness.
The Voice America Talk Radio Network is on Instagram. Make sure you follow us and comment on our pictures from behind the scenes at our radio shows, live events, and around the network. We want to see what you have to share as well. Check us out on Instagram at Voice America Talk Radio.
We're on the pulse of the world with great shows and hosts. The Voice America Health and Wellness channel is also on Twitter. We've got ideas to keep you healthy, breaking health news, and more. Follow us on Twitter at VoiceAM Health. That's at VoiceAM Health.
Do you ever wonder if you're taking the right vitamins and supplements? What about prescription medicines you may be taking? Is it a dangerous or effective combination? Now you can find out by tuning in to your daily dose with host Doreen Doucette. We'll discuss the proper ways that supplements and natural therapies can benefit your health. You'll also hear about the best vitamin brands to use, hear from experts, and more. Listen live Wednesdays at 10 a.m. Eastern Time and 7 a.m. Pacific Time on Voice America Health and Wellness.
You are listening to Falling Through the Cracks with your host, Dr. Rebecca Risk. To reach the program today, please call in to 1-866-472-5792. Again, that's 1-866-472-5792. You may also send an email directly to Dr. Risk. The email address is anantacalgary@gmail.com. Now, back to Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Falling Through the Cracks. We're back from the breaks. Today I'm talking with Dr. Arianna Sholes-Douglas, and we're discussing her book, The Menopause Myth. So what is the first myth that you would like to dispel?
Well, the first myth is really around when menopause starts and what it looks like. So, again, we spoke that the typical the average woman, I should say, will be menopausal around 52, and but she doesn't realize that that means really, as you know, early, if you be 42, 45, you could be menopausal, and that's completely normal, meaning you haven't had your menstrual cycle for a year. So those symptoms, it's not like you're going to go from, just premenopausal to menopausal without the symptoms. So you could go into your menopause phase, so to speak, having not had a menstrual cycle for a year, but, for 2 or 3 years prior to that, you were having hot flashes, And so people think, oh, I'm menopause, and then I'm going to have these symptoms. But the symptoms actually predate when you are actually menopausal. And that predate can be, again, early as late 30s, early 40s.
Yeah, like what we spoke about before the break, that's a time people aren't really thinking about it. Now, of course, everybody talks about how the hormones are changing. So what's actually happening with our hormones when this change happens?
Well, that kind of leads us to another myth, which is that people think, well, the main reason you have these symptoms of menopause is because your estrogen levels are going down. And your estrogen levels are declining, but really what happens prior to that is that we become what's called anovulatory, meaning we're not ovulating with each menstrual cycle. And with that ovulation, typically our body would make a cyst called the corpus luteum that would make progesterone, which helps to balance the estrogen that we're also making. But when we're not ovulating, we don't make that corpus luteum, we don't make the progesterone. And so progesterone, though, as a hormone, is very stabilizing. It's more calming, and kind of when you compare it to how it works in the body to estrogen. We even give progesterone to pregnant women to kind of calm their uteri down if they're like in preterm labor. So progesterone also helps with our sleep cycle. It helps with anxiety. So women start out with having really issues with progesterone metabolism first, and that, again, leads to irritability, anxiety, issues with sleep, and those are commonly the first symptoms that women experience, not so much the hot flashes. The hot flashes are there, but hormonally they are happening a little later because our estrogen levels start to decline, and, our estrogen levels kind of relative to where they are on our baseline, when they decline, that's when it's theorized that we'll have these hot flashes. But there's really no exact understanding as to why we get these power surges, as we call them. But at the end of the day, these hormonal fluctuations between decline in progesterone, decline in estrogen relative to wherever your baseline is, and even testosterone, which is a very important hormone in this whole process. And a little known fact is that we actually, as women, make more testosterone than we make estrogen. But we just don't metabolize our testosterone the same way. We don't use it the same way, obviously, as men. But at the end of the day, it's just as important in that kind of trifecta of hormones: estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. They're all in concert.
So one thing that women talk about, of course, is hormone replacement therapy, which was really big quite a while ago, and then people became afraid of it. So what's going on there? I think this is one of the myths that you talk about, and there's a lot of information that conflicts with itself on hormone replacement therapy.
Yes, it's a great question. Very good point. So I always like to start off by saying I'm not a hormone pusher, but hormones can be a wonderful, beautiful thing for some people. So before I even like to talk about hormones, I at least like people to know that we don't start with that. I always start with diet and what you're putting in your mouth, because that generally is your number one drug, your number one food is the number one drug that we start with, and obviously our stressors and the rest of our life, which ultimately impact our hormones. But at the end of the day, hormone replacement for some women can be really a life. It really can change a life. So a quick anecdote is that I had a patient. She came in. She came in accompanied with her husband. She was in tears. She was basically a hot mess, literally and figuratively. And she was one of the few patients that, seeing her for the first time, I was just like, I'm just going to give her some estrogen. Like, I'm going to give her some hormones just because I can't even get through to her. And she was just depressed, anxious, couldn't function. She came back a month later after being on the hormones, and she had so much more clarity. She was able to now we could start working on the real issues, which were her stressors, her diet, and everything. So fast forward several months, she's still on the hormones, but she's been able to transform her diet and really the way her whole family eats. The hormones at the end of the day represent a quality of life. And so if for some women they are having drastic symptoms and they really haven't been able to get around it, then I definitely think it's an option to consider. The pendulum has shifted. There was a really big study, and really at the end of the day, they reanalyzed that data, realized that they analyzed it wrong, and that really the hormones aren't quite as bad as we thought they were. And so they really kind of started to stratify the different groups. They kind of lumped all these women into one group, but when they looked at younger women, they noticed that they actually did well, or at least weren't harmed by it, had any adverse effect. But when they started giving estrogen to 60 plus 70-year-old women, those were the women that had the issue. So really, we just had to pull it back and look more critically at the data and understand when and why hormones would be a good option. So hormone replacement, generally speaking, during the perimenopausal years for a short period of time, really has mostly a beneficial impact. It's a benefit to bone health. It can be a benefit just overall to mental health, decreasing risk, whatever, for heart disease, Alzheimer's. We know that certain exposure to estrogen at certain times is good, but after a certain period, it's probably not as good. So there's a lot of confusion there. I probably just made it as clear as mud, but that's kind of where it is. So when people ask me, hey, at the end of the day, should I take these hormones? And my question is, it's all about quality of life. And if you want to maximize your quality of life, then you have to do the work through nutrition or Chinese medicine or whatever those things are that are going to help balance you out, or take the pill. There's a whole different way. There are all kind of different ways to get to the same endpoint. But at the end of the day, hormones tend to be that replacement, tend to be an easier fix for a lot of people. But again, don't recommend it. Everybody doesn't need it. In fact, most people could go without it if they were willing to adjust their lifestyle.
Well, I think that you and I, practice very similarly. It's about the individual in front of you. And, I do explain to people that, your hormones are supposed to decline. This is what happens as we get older. But you've got a period of time where you're uncomfortable. So what is going to get you through that, and what works best for you in this moment so that you can get to that point where you feel more comfortable with your life and without being, a lot of women are very uncomfortable, and it is necessary, and some things just don't work for some people where they work for others.
Right.
So you mentioned diet, and you said that's your first stop with people. What does that look like for menopause? What should people do?
Well, I talk a lot about and feel very strongly about what I call the food elimination diet. And basically, it's the elimination for a short period of time of the most kind of inflammatory foods in our diet, which would be gluten, dairy, sugar, corn, soy. And, one person's cure is another man's poison. So, case in point, I have an autoimmune condition. So with autoimmune issues, you generally, sometimes, not always, nightshades as a food can cause more of an issue, more inflammation. And when I did the food elimination diet, which was basically a month of eliminating those things I listed, gluten, dairy, sugar, corn, soy, the doctor I was seeing also recommended me take out the nightshades, which I thought was stupid, because I was like, well, tomatoes, those are vegetables or fruit or whatever you want to call them, but aren't tomatoes good for you? And so she had to explain kind of how nightshades affect individuals with autoimmunity, and this was probably 20 years ago. And so the first food that I put back is you introduce each food separately. So if you, for example, I was like, I know that I'm not going to be allergic, or tomatoes are, I know that's not a problem in my life. So that was the first food I introduced, and that's when I realized how I was so impacted by a tomato. By the next day, I could barely get out of bed. I had total body fatigue, headache. I couldn't think clearly. And I generally think it's a wonderful tool to show people how an individual food really impacts them. And for those who are willing to do it and really, do the work, because you can't really cheat on it, you just take it out of your system, and then you introduce it back one at a time. And then you'll really be able to see. But the average person, when they take out gluten, dairy, sugar, alcohol, corn, they're just going to feel better. And that doesn't mean you can never eat it, but it does increase your awareness. So I just ask people to be aware of how food is impacting them. And for menopause, that's going to be specifically sugar and alcohol, because those two things tend to really drive up hot flashes, the irritability, the issues with sleep. The whole blood sugar axis is just kind of thrown off. So that's how food can be a huge part of managing it. And women, for example, they don't realize that glass of wine that you have at night, that's what's causing your hot flash. So they're not happy to hear that, but maybe that means you drink half a glass of wine as opposed to 2 glasses, but at least you have the awareness that wine is probably not your friend, at least right now.
Well, and I definitely have seen this. About 10 years ago, I had 2 sisters who were going through menopause together, and I did that exact diet with them, and they were symptom-free unless they had beer. And they would come in and tell on each other, which I thought was quite amusing, except that they were having beer together. They were having the beer together. But, it was quite cute because they would, hang out together and then tell me that so-and-so had beer. And I was, I told them that it was really important for them to assess for themselves how they felt. And, you can get away with something sometimes, and you're the one gauging how uncomfortable that you are. So just like you said, be aware of how food makes you feel, and you woke up the next day and you could barely get out of bed, and sometimes it's not that extreme, and sometimes we have to eat more of it to experience that, or sometimes we know right away. But to be aware of what that's making you feel like, so that you have the control over how bad you're going to feel when you do those things, like have a beer with your sibling.
Exactly. It's like at least you're going into it with eyes wide open, as opposed to, like, oh God, why do I feel so bad, and just never connecting the dots that you had a 6-pack, and beer may have represented the wheat. May represent just the yeast, alcohol, whatever, ferment, whatever, however they make the beer. There's just all types of things there that could go sideways and have you not feeling so great. But for me, I realized, I can't drink wine, but I can drink vodka. So vodka didn't bother me as much. Of course, I couldn't have like 10 ounces of vodka, but I just didn't feel the same issue. And I think that really spoke more to the blood sugar than anything else. But alcohol, at the end of the day, for a lot of reasons, can trigger some not so pleasant symptoms.
Well, thank you. I think that's important. We're going to take a quick break so everybody can think about that. We're talking today with Dr. Arianna Sholes-Douglas, and we're discussing her book, The Menopause Myth. And we'll be back shortly.
These days, everyone is looking for information on staying young, healthy, and fit. The Voice America Health and Wellness Network is here to help you on your quest to better health and a better you. We talk about everything from diet, fitness, and aging to substance abuse, personal growth, mental health, and much more. Learn from our experts who cover health and wellness from traditional and holistic perspectives. Tune in to the Voice America Health and Wellness Network. Healthy living starts here.
Have you had a chance to check out Voice America's online magazine and blog? If you love our hosts and shows, check out articles that give an even deeper perspective. plus topics about health and fitness, movie reviews, philosophy, business tips and tactics, spirituality, positive thought, current events, and even more about your favorite hosts. It's just a click away at blog.voiceamerica.com. That's blog.voiceamerica.com. The Voice America Press Blog. All access, all the time.
Frankly Speaking About Cancer is a program designed to empower survivors and their caregivers to deal with the social and emotional challenges of cancer. The show will invite physicians, researchers, nurses, social workers, patients, and caregivers to share their advice on how to live a better life with cancer. Join host Kim Tibaldo, President and CEO of the Cancer Support Community, Tuesday afternoons at 1 p.m. Pacific Time and 4 p.m. Eastern Time on the Voice America Health and Wellness Network.
You are listening to Falling Through the Cracks with your host, Dr. Rebecca Risk. To reach the program today, please call in to 1-866-472-5792. Again, that's 1-866-472-5792. You may also send an email directly to Dr. Risk. The email address is anantacalgary@gmail.com. Now, back to Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Arianna Sholes-Douglas. So, Dr. Arianna, in your book, you talk about, you have a whole chapter on fatigue, and you talk about thyroid and adrenal problems, and those are probably separate issues. So maybe just talk about how the thyroid affects people women as they're going through menopause.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That's actually one of my favorite chapters in the book, and where I get actually a lot of feedback. People who weren't going through menopause was like, oh my God, I had a thyroid issue. So hypothyroidism, which is low functioning thyroid, affects women, more disproportionately than men, as a lot of other diseases. But a lot of patients are walking around with less than optimal functioning thyroid and not realizing it. And the most common one of the most common things I see in the office is that I talked to my endocrinologist and they told me my thyroid was normal. So if I had $1 or however many dollars for every time somebody told me that, needless to say, I have a lot of money. Because I feel like endocrinologists, and again, I know that there's not a lot of positive things I've said about the medical field in general, but I obviously there's a time and a place for how we practice medicine, but in general, endocrinologists, I feel, have kind of really done a disservice to a lot of patients in this area because we're using the standard measurement, which is we look at thyroid-stimulating hormone, and using that measurement, there's a range, right, that people can fall anywhere from 0.45 to 4.5. But the average patient is optimally functioning with a TSH of probably less than 2. But what's happening is that we're waiting for patients to kind of be on that extreme end of the spectrum to be like, okay, now we can really address your thyroid. So there's a disagreement in the medical community as to what is the optimal TSH that we should be using as a reference. But that was another thing that I experienced personally, which was I have Hashimoto's, which is an autoimmune condition affecting the thyroid, and that can also affect your labs. But I didn't understand any of this, and I kind of was still in the mindset of a conventional medical doctor, and, my TSH looks normal. But in actuality, it really wasn't normal, and it wasn't until I went and saw more alternative or holistic naturopaths that were like, oh, no, this is not where you want to be with your thyroid. So it changed my whole life. It changed my practice of medicine. And I want to educate women in particular that know what your numbers are. If you're feeling fatigue, hair loss, constipation, always cold, just not having the clarity of thought, oftentimes it can mimic symptoms of menopause, and it's actually your thyroid. So know what a TSH value, what it should be. Know what those numbers are. I talk very specifically about them in the book. And then, find a practitioner that is willing to work with you around that because, again, the average primary care doc and endocrinologist here in the States is not going to treat unless they see a TSH that's really high. But at that point, for a lot of people, they're not functioning very well at all, and their quality of life is diminished substantially. So I talk a lot about that in the book. I feel very passionate about that, as you may or may not be able to tell.
Well, I'm actually glad you brought it up because it's a conversation that I have every day. And, I had somebody shadow me a few months ago, and she was like, you talk about thyroid with everybody. I'm like, yeah, because they're just like what you experience. There's information missing on the conventional level, and the quality of life isn't there. And I think you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think some studies show that 80% of people with thyroid problems actually have Hashimoto's but are going undiagnosed because it's not even tested.
It's not.
Yeah, I think that doctors are very, very resistant to test for Hashimoto's. Even if somebody knows that they have Hashimoto's, they can't get any follow-up. And it seems to me that we're just slipping through the cracks here being ignored. And, of course, we're fatigued, like you said, constipated, dry skin, our hair's falling out, our sex lives are down, and very, very uncomfortable. But then again, I think this goes to this woman in front of us, is she just complaining because her TSH is normal? This can't be her thyroid. And then off women are sent to suffer for a long time until it gets more severe.
Yeah, or put on an antidepressant as opposed to, treating it from a functional medicine approach. Like, well, what's the problem? I mean, from a truly functional medicine approach, then we go even deeper to, again, from a Chinese medicine perspective. So it can be through diet. It could be through hormone replacement of the thyroid. It could be through whatever ways that are needed, acupuncture, to get your body back in line and your thyroid functioning. But you're so spot on with the Hashimoto's. I'm just amazed that the average patient I see who has a thyroid condition they don't even know what Hashimoto's is. They've never been tested, and they don't understand. Like, that's, again, where inflammation and the diet are so huge, and stress, because you could be, the same patient I was telling you about that I put on hormone replacement because she was a hot mess, she also had thyroid disease. Well, she didn't realize at the same time she had Hashimoto's. So she came in with, she was in menopause. Her thyroid was, like one of the worst thyroids I'd ever seen as well. Her TSH was like 17 or something crazy. And so we got her all tuned up, and about 6 months later she comes back and she's feeling very irritable. And she's like, I need more progesterone. I was like, really? And I said, well, let's do your labs. Let's check everything again. Well, come to find out, her Hashimoto's had now kind of decreased, meaning, the inflammation, the flare that she was having earlier had now subsided. So her antibodies went down. So her thyroid was actually functioning better. So she was actually now being overtreated. So I had to lower her thyroid dose, not give her more progesterone, but I had to lower her thyroid dose because now she was hyperthyroid and she was having symptoms of that. And that's how the perfect example of how everything overlaps, because, as an average patient, you're not going to be able to know, do I need more progesterone? Do I need less thyroid? That isn't an easy thing for the average person, even a clinician necessarily, to figure out unless you really understand how food, inflammation, stress, all of this affects autoimmunity. If you don't even know, or you're not even paying attention to the fact that the patient has an autoimmune disorder, then you can't really help them improve without dealing with the underlying issue, which is, inflammation. So, yes, I think I went off on a tangent, but yes, to what you said.
It was a good tangent, though, because, I hope women listening realize that you and I are talking about this because it's so common. And it's really, really important if you have a thyroid problem or you're just experiencing some of those symptoms, to get your book, because you explain Hashimoto's in it, and then talk to your doctor about it, because they're not going to screen for Hashimoto's if your TSH is normal. But it's important to understand that you can have these antibodies towards your thyroid happening in the background with a normal looking TSH, and I think the average is about 10 years before, as your thyroid is getting damaged and you have all these symptoms, and then your TSH will start to show up. And who wants to go through 10 years of being uncomfortable without an answer? So if you can get your doctor, right? I wouldn't. So your book, you explain that really, really well. And I think it's important for women to start at anybody, really, it's not just women, but to start asking those questions so that the awareness can start to happen. And this is how common it is. I talk about it every day, and I'm sure you do as well. Thyroid problems are on the rise. I think they're in every family, and whether or not Hashimoto's is there, we don't know. A lot of people are going undiagnosed.
Undiagnosed for sure.
So you talk about adrenal fatigue as well. What's that?
Well, adrenal fatigue, I think, is a little more nebulous and a little harder to pin down. There are some labs that we can look at that kind of give us clues for sure. But, I mean, it's really just a constellation of lots of symptoms. But at the end of the day, our adrenals are there to help us respond to stress. And, stress, as they described it, prehistoric times is the saber-toothed tiger. Now stress is, that boss you hate, the traffic, a bad relationship, just not sleeping, and even the foods and the environmental stressors, just the news, that's stress. So that is kind of bombarding us constantly. Our bodies really aren't designed, our adrenals for sure really weren't designed for us to kind of have this constant drip, drip, drip of stress. And so over time, as opposed to those sporadic kind of bursts of norepinephrine, epinephrine, and all the things we need to kind of get our fight or flight on, over time, that's kind of a chronic thing. And so over time, our adrenals aren't able to produce and drive and give us the same push of energy that we need. And also, just chronically, they're depleted. So this can manifest in different ways depending on where we are in that whole cycle of adrenal fatigue. So early on, we might be what we call wired but tired. So there's a lot of kind of anxiety, irritability, but there's still inability to sleep. And that has everything to do with kind of our cortisol levels and how they're increasing at times when they really should be decreasing, specifically, at night. So we can't quite turn it off. And then our world is even more complicated through, the electronics and everything that we're just constantly stimulating ourselves with. So the fatigue, can be measured through a few different hormones, and really it's more of the symptoms that you're having and ruling out other things that would cause it. And really doing things that at the end of the day are going to boost the adrenals back up. So adaptogens are some of my favorite tools, like ashwagandha is a very popular one. So things and supplements, again, anything from Chinese medicine to supplements to even certain foods that are going to help support your adrenal and help you. But that is a harder thing to fix. It's not as easy sometimes to me as the thyroid. The thyroid, to me, is pretty straightforward. It's like, yep, there's your TSH, that's this, there's your Hashimoto's. I can kind of fix that. Adrenals take a while because there's so many levels of stress that we experience, and you can't make that go away. And you just basically, we have to help our bodies respond better to it.
Well, and I think one thing that you talk about at the end of your book is self-care, which will help with that stress and adrenal fatigue and everything else. But I think that was an important point to put in there because most women, they want to take care of everybody else and they're the last priority on their list. And I'm sure you have this conversation as well, but I tell them, what's going to happen to your family if you can't help them anymore? You are the hub, so you are important to have the downtime and to do the things that you need to do to recover and regenerate yourself.
Yeah, and as women, we like to carry that badge around. Like, look at me, I got 2 kids and I own my business and I'm doing all of these things, and we almost brag about how tired we are. But at the end of the day, you have to fill up your own cup first, and it's not easy because sometimes our partners, don't always understand. Our kids may or may not understand. Our friends. There was a period of time when I used to really almost religiously go to Miraval, which is one of our better spas here, and even in North America. And it's a little pretty penny, but I would go and just spend a day or two, and I would feel very renewed and refreshed. And that's just what I love to do for me. But yeah, sometimes I get the side eye from friends like, oh, she's going to Miraval, or even my husband. And so I had to really push beyond that and be like, yeah, but, and remember. But it's so easy to do for other people than it is for ourselves. And then there's that stress of the resentment, right? Then you're like, you're mad because you know you deserve it, but you can't quite prove it. So you kind of go along. But then there's that. So at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily have to be, a several $1,000 spa day. It could be just a hot bath in the morning. I mean, that's kind of taken the place of my spa days these days. But, just knowing I have a moment. I have a little sign on my door now. It says, do not disturb. When I say do not disturb, that means do not disturb. And even if it's just for 5 minutes that I have to just sit and be in my space, I just have to take that time, figure out what brings me joy, so I can fill my cup up, because it doesn't feel good anymore to give when you literally have nothing there. And that's exactly how it feels. It's how I feel when I come home and I just tell my friends or family, I don't have anything left for you today. So this is where I am. My cup is empty today. Don't look at me.
I think it takes a lot of maturity to get to that point in our lives. We do like to burn ourselves out. Now, you talk about everything we've talked about today is in great detail and very easy to understand in your book. So if somebody wants more information, how can they get a hold of you or your book?
Sure. So the book is on our website, drarianna.com. It's also on Amazon and I think Barnes & Noble and all the other major book outlets. And in terms of contacting me, you can contact me through the website, drarianna.com, for more information, or can just email me directly at drarianna@drarianna.com. So it's pretty simple.
Perfect.
And, yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I had a great conversation, and I think it was really informative and important for anybody, not just women, but anybody who knows a woman to listen and understand what's going on.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So everybody, today we were talking with Dr. Arianna Sholes-Douglas, and her book is called The Menopause Myth, What Your Mother, Doctor, and Friends Haven't Told You About Life After 35. Thank you so much for listening to our conversation today. If you want more information about my story, you can find that on my website at dr-risk.com. Don't forget to follow me on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and you can always send me an email at anantacalgary@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to make today a great day.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive. Please join Dr. Rebecca Risk again next Monday at noon Eastern Time and 9 a.m. Pacific Time on the Voice America Health and Wellness.